Yet another legal loss for Trump. This time, the Ninth Circuit shut down his attempts to gut the 14th Amendment and get rid of birthright citizenship. I'm Shant Karnikian. That's Brian Kabateck. We're two lawyers at Kabateck LLP, and this is Civil Action on the Legal AF Network. If you like this content, hit that subscribe button so you can see more of us and find out when the next episode drops. Brian, tell us a little bit about the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, this is interesting. We'll talk about the case in a second, but the background on this whole birthright citizenship, which is so well grounded in U.S. constitutional law, really deserves a quick and brief stroll through the legal landscape here. So before the Civil War, there was a case that came out, one of the worst cases of all time the United States Supreme Court's ever issued, called Dred Scott. Everyone learns it on the first day of con law in law school. That case held that slaves and the descendants of slaves are not U.S. citizens. So then the Civil War comes along, and in the end of the Civil War, there's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment did away with slavery. The 14th Amendment is probably the most important today for a lot of reasons we don't need to get into today. But the 14th Amendment specifically said that you are a U.S. citizen if you are born on U.S. soil. And there are a couple of very limited exceptions to that, like if you're born to a foreign diplomat visiting the United States. And in fact, in the two areas when this was being debated, because remember, amendments to the United States Constitution have to be ratified by the states, in the ratification to the public, it was made very clear that this meant anyone that was born on U.S. citizen. No restriction for somebody who's born here to someone who's not a citizen, no restrictions for that. Plus, there was an opponent to the amendment, and that opponent issued his complete understanding that if you were born to someone who was not documented or not legal here, you would in fact still be a citizen. They confirmed it, and that's why he had an opposition to it, and his opposition was overruled. Then we go forward to a case in 1898 called United States versus Wong Kim Ark. At the time, Chinese laborers were not allowed to be legal citizens of the United States. They were guest workers. And the issue when Wong Kim Ark, who was born to Chinese laborers in the United States, was whether or not he was a U.S. citizen. And the United States Supreme Court has said consistently yes. This issue, to end the history here, and I could go on for quite some time, but the history here, Shant, is that over time, this question has been raised. Should we allow undocumented citizens to become, who have children here, to become citizens themselves, the children to become citizens? And resoundingly, those efforts have completely failed. And every legal scholar asked about this says, look, in order to do that, if you really wanted to do that, you would have to amend the Constitution and have a constitutional amendment, which means 2/3 of the states would have to ratify it, and it would become the law. But Donald Trump, who clearly doesn't believe in the rule of the law, just decided in his executive order on the first day of presidency to strip people of birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. And that now brings us, Shant, to your scholarly discussion on this very case.
Right. So this was a case challenging that. It was a number of states that are part of the Ninth Circuit that brought this challenge, and the court ruled in their favor. And there are a few carve-outs and caveats. Specifically, one of the justices that concurred said, the states themselves don't have standing to challenge it. But generally, everyone was in agreement. And it's a masterclass, I think, in sort of good opinion writing from a legal opinion standard. And it does a good job of explaining the history behind the 14th Amendment, how and why it should be construed, and has been consistently construed very broadly, that right to the guarantee of citizenship for anyone, almost anyone, with those narrow exceptions Brian talked about, born on U.S. soil, regardless of their parents' immigration status. And it helps to enshrine that right. And it totally says, an executive order like this, with just a stroke of a pen, a president cannot do that. There's a whole process. And, Brian, you mentioned one thing that I think we were talking about before we hopped on to talk about this, which is, have there been challenges to this? And this is something Brian and I researched. There have been challenges to this, But this isn't a main Republican talking point. This isn't a big concern that's on anyone's mind, not even Republicans' minds. And while there have been challenges, they've failed miserably. It's never gained traction. It's never been a close call where there's been a circuit split in a certain jurisdiction where they say, oh yeah, maybe we should get rid of birthright citizenship. There's some wiggle room in the 14th Amendment. No, it's plainly clear that you cannot do this. You can't use an executive order to get rid of or modify the 14th Amendment. In fact, the language they use is the opinion of the majority in this case says that the executive order is flatly inconsistent with the text and history of the 14th Amendment. And it said that the court can't accept, quote, a reading of the 14th Amendment that Congress explicitly rejected during its drafting, because this was the intent behind these laws matters too. And oftentimes courts, when they analyze laws and the constitutionality of laws and attempts to change them or reinterpret them, or in this case, modify them through an executive order signed by one man, courts look at the drafting history. They look at the legislative history, how Congress talked about it. That's why those discussions in Congress where we see people yelling at each other are so important. And over here, even during the drafting of the 14th Amendment, it was explicitly rejected that there's some wiggle room here that you can exclude the children of immigrants who are here illegally or in an undocumented manner. So I think this is a big win for these states. It's a big win for not just the states and people and immigrants in American citizens. It's a big win for the Constitution, for democracy.
There's a bit of a wonky procedural issue here, which I'm sure you would expect nothing less from us if you listen to us, is because we're wonky and nerdy. But people may recall the end of term June decision by the United States Supreme Court saying that you can't just bring these cases and get national injunctions. So first of all, this injunction is limited to the Ninth Circuit, which is effectively all of the Western United States, Hawaii, Guam, those territories. Very, very large district. And also it's clearly teeing this up for United States Supreme Court review next term. And whether or not the U.S. Supreme Court issues a stay on this will be something to stay tuned for. But to be clear, that opinion in June from the United States Supreme Court did not touch this specific issue. It was procedural. It said an individual doesn't have the right to bring a motion for a preliminary nationwide injunction. They can bring an injunction for themselves. But the court left wide open the ability of states to bring these kinds of actions. And in this opinion, the Ninth Circuit specifically addresses that issue by saying, yes, this does affect the states because if government funding is eliminated for people who are subject to birthright citizenship, so that's, potentially a wide group of people, those government services, those government dollars are not going to flow to the states because they're no longer counted as a citizen or legal resident. And those services are going to have to be paid for by the state. So the state has a direct harm, direct basis or reason. And the Supreme Court said that absolutely could happen. But I guess my final word on this, Shant, is that, stay tuned. There's a lot more going on here. There is going to be other decisions. There are going to be circuit splits if they don't exist already. This is going to lead to the United States Supreme Court. I suspect and predict they will grant certiorari next term. And if they have an ounce of judicial ethics and care to follow precedent, they will quickly shut this down once and for all. Sideshow? Yeah, but it's more than a sideshow. This is part of the MAGA base. This is what they want. So as usual, Shant, you get the last word.
Yeah, it is a bit of a sideshow, but I think it's an important battle because something like this, it really affects people's fundamental human rights. It impacts how the Constitution should be interpreted, not just on this issue, but on other issues. We start chipping away at the 14th Amendment here. And then what else are we going to chip away? At what point are we going to start, creating exceptions for the First Amendment and other, basic rights that are enshrined in the Constitution and are the foundations of our democracy? I think it's an important decision. This is an important issue to follow. Fortunately, this decision maintains the status quo, which I think is a huge win. People aren't going to get stripped of their citizenship with the stroke of Donald Trump's pen. And that's a big win. I think that's a big win. And the citizens of this country, people living in this country, people that believe in democracy should take that win. And we'll keep following this. And inevitably, as you said, Brian, this is going to end up in the Supreme Court, and we'll see what happens in the lead up to that. We'll talk about that when those briefings get filed. Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode. I'm Shant Karnikian, and that's Brian Kabateck. We're two lawyers at Kabateck LLP. If you like this content, hit that subscribe button so you can be up to date and be notified next time we drop an episode. And we'll see you next time on the Legal AF Network.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.